Hi there. Today I'm back with another sexual exploitation scandal, completely unrelated to my recent videos about sexual exploitation occurring in Vienna, Austria. This incident occurred in Toronto, Canada, circa 2020. Before I begin, I want to clarify what I mean when I use the word grooming in this video. Many people incorrectly believe that grooming only refers to children, but in safeguarding, psychology, and exploitation research, grooming is more broadly understood as a process of incrementally building trust, eroding boundaries, exploiting vulnerabilities, and creating conditions that make later exploitation more likely. Basically everything that I already explained in my other videos. But in this context, the female subject holds majority status, meaning that she is an adult. What we're observing is still technically grooming. That's because adults can be groomed at any age. Age alone does not eliminate vulnerability. Workplace hierarchies, experience gaps, emotional vulnerability, dependency, admiration, social isolation, power imbalances, all of these things can create circumstances in which incremental boundary erosion becomes possible. So this video is an examination of one specific dynamic through this framework. Of course, I'm not suggesting that this is prevalent in any work environment, specifically the Canadian film industry, but unfortunately this did happen within the Canadian film industry, and so I'm making an example of it. But essentially I'm just examining specific behaviors and asking whether they are consistent with recognized mechanisms of grooming and sexual exploitation. In my conclusion, yes. So essentially, this occurred during the COVID pandemic in 2020 on the set of the Umbrella Academy at a film studio in Toronto, Canada. It involved a young female who was entering the Canadian film industry for the very first time. She was new to the profession, new to the studio, new to all of the people surrounding her. Whereas at the opposite end of the spectrum, at the opposite end of the hierarchy, was one of the studio's most senior employees, an adult male in his 60s with decades of experience. On paper, this could appear to be an ordinary workplace relationship between a senior employee and a junior colleague. So one of the biggest misconceptions about exploitation is that people expect to see immediate coercion. They imagine obvious intimidation, explicit threats, overwhelming force, but in reality, many exploitative relationships develop incrementally, and this is what I often talk about in most of my videos. Grooming often occurs incrementally and slowly. Boundaries are tested. Small comments become larger comments. Professional relationships gradually become personal. Behavior that would have previously seemed inappropriate on day one slowly become normalized by month 3, month 4. And this process is sometimes referred to as incremental boundary erosion. Again, I often talk about this in my other videos, so if you are interested in learning more about grooming dynamics, the psychological drivers, the mechanisms used, then please refer to those videos also. But looking at the behavioral patterns, so the reported interactions between this young female and this elder male employee, several recurring themes begin to emerge. So there are repeated declarations of affection from this senior employee toward the junior female colleague, despite there being no long-standing relationship that would ordinarily justify such intimacy. You know, he goes around claiming, "I love you, I love you, I love you." This is an elder male in his 60s running around the studio declaring his love for a very young female whom he does not know. Obviously this seems exceptionally regressive for his age. There are attempts to create emotional uniqueness by comparing this young female to his deceased former partner. "You remind me of my dead girlfriend," suggesting that she occupies the same uniquely meaningful place in his life. There are, repeated disclosures of this nature designed to evoke sympathy, including discussions of his serious illness and survival. The senior male colleague allegedly had leukemia. He was in remission, and he was leveraging this to gain sympathy from the young female. And he would often present her with philosophical quotes: "Life is too short, seize the day, live each moment as if it's your last." So essentially, he may as well just be reading from a book of quotes of cliched philosophy. But essentially, he leverages this for sympathy, and the young female begins to express admiration for this senior colleague's outlook on life. "I just love his outlook on life and his perspective on life." I mean, in isolation, these behaviors, they don't look exploitative. However, they're occurring adjacent to progressive boundary violations, and so that's why, cumulatively, it becomes very important to examine this and recognize the patterns. And so another mechanism that this senior male colleague utilizes is something that's generally referred to as negging. This is a particularly notable behavior that psychologists and relationship researchers commonly would refer to as negging. So negging basically combines a sexual advance with an insult, criticism or implication that the recipient is somehow fortunate to be receiving attention. So the psychological effect is essentially to destabilize the confidence of the young female victim whilst simultaneously positioning, in this case, the senior male colleague as the source of validation. So rather than expressing attraction directly, attraction is reframed as though it is almost a favor being offered. And so I have a quote right here that is an example of the senior male colleagues utilizing of negging. And so the young female says, "I think he likes butt stuff. I think he's into butt stuff." And when asked why, she responds, "Well, he said to me that he would like to lick my asshole, but he may need mouthwash afterwards." Now, this is a classic example of negging. So essentially, he's saying, I will do something for you sexually, but I will need something afterwards to basically sterilize my mouth because you are dirty. So it's classic negging. Also, we can see by this point that incremental boundary erosion has resulted in this female not perceiving the danger or not perceiving how inappropriate this comment is. We then have, contradictions. So remember I told you that this elder male in his 60s is essentially running around the studio hassling this young female employee saying, "I love you, I love you, I love you." And this young female is saying, "Well, I don't not like you." These repeated declarations of love suggest profound emotional attachment. Yet, of course, he doesn't really know this young female. When the young female indicated that she may only be interested in a sexual encounter, the response becomes, well, that's okay, I'll take whatever I can get. Now, this contradiction matters. If love disappears the moment sex becomes available, it raises the question of whether the repeated declarations of love reflected genuine attachment or whether they primarily functioned as a means of obtaining intimacy. Now, I would align with the latter. Also, most people objectively would recognize this situation and come to the same conclusion. But anyway, we then have escalation. So over time, the relationship moves beyond verbal boundary violations into sexual activity associated with the workplace. At this stage, the issue is no longer simply interpersonal. It becomes a workplace safeguarding issue. So professional boundaries have collapsed entirely, organizational trust has been compromised, and also we have to recognize that this was during a period in which COVID protocols themselves were being implemented and enforced, placing exceptional demands upon workplace safety. So basically, we have this young junior female colleague and one of their, if not the most senior employee at this film studio. They begin engaging in, inappropriate sexual activity in the workplace, around the studio, in the toilets, in private spaces, on the set, in the car park, in and around the studio itself. Now, of course, this is against protocol. But secondly, this was during COVID, so it's also breaching of, strictly enforced governmental protocol. So this is serious, this is multifaceted, and it's very serious. And so ultimately, this continues for maybe 2 more months, and then eventually, suddenly, the young female is dismissed. And here is where it gets highly controversial. So the publicly presented explanation did not specify inappropriate sexual conduct between a senior male employee and a junior female colleague as the reason for dismissal. Instead, another workplace incident became the stated reason surrounding their departure. And of course, this raises an important institutional question. When misconduct is obfuscated rather than accurately recorded, organizations receiving future employment references may never become aware of behavior that could be relevant to safeguarding decisions. So essentially, there was a subterfuge that was implemented, which was that an unrelated male colleague injured himself on the film set doing something inappropriately that he should not have been doing, using some equipment in a way that he should not have been using it, and he subsequently injured himself. Now, apparently, studio protocol dictates that everybody must evacuate. You must go in the opposite direction of danger. Do not run toward this man and help him. Now, apparently, only 2 people ran toward this injured man to help him. Yep, the young female and the senior male employee with whom she has been engaging in inappropriate workplace sexual activity with, and also a breach of extremely stringent COVID protocol and regulation, were the only 2 people who ran toward this injured colleague. And everybody else, and we're talking well over 100 employees at the studio on the set that day, evacuated, even though personally I myself would have run towards danger to help somebody who is potentially dying. That is just human nature. So this is obviously highly suspicious and questionable. Now, eventually I came to understand that this sequence of events, it did actually happen, but not in the way that was stated. It was basically instrumentalized and reframed. It was basically seen as a good opportunity to get rid of these two employees after it had already been discovered that they had been engaging in inappropriate sexual activity in the workplace environment at this studio, and also in breach of serious COVID regulations and protocol. However, because the reason was not stated as sexual misconduct, this elder male, this senior employee of the studio, was able to be re-employed almost immediately across Toronto at another film studio. Furthermore, I was able to obtain information later that revealed historic incidents of inappropriate sexual activity at the workplace perpetrated by this very same senior employee. Which is actually very common. Oftentimes, a workplace predator of senior status doesn't suddenly one day become exceptionally observant and perceptive of a young female's vulnerabilities. This behavior is usually psychosexually driven, meaning that the perpetrator has likely been engaging in similar behaviors for a very long time. And so at his advanced age, he is not just experienced in a professional capacity regarding predation. He will essentially have the experience to hone and refine his skills and ability to cumulative risk stack and assess the exploitability of young females. And so, anyway, this was really serious. But in this case, it's not simply about these two individuals. It raises broader questions about how workplaces identify incremental boundary erosion before it reaches crisis point. And so, again, when you hear the word grooming, don't always innately think, child. It can apply to anybody of any age. Grooming is essentially incremental boundary erosion. The question is how workplaces identify incremental boundary erosion before it reaches crisis point. Whether organizations recognize the behavioral warning signs early enough, and when they do, how do they process this? How do they deal with it? And also seniority, familiarity, and institutional trust sometimes allow inappropriate conduct to develop unnoticed. And I'm going to touch on this in a moment. But lastly, protecting organizational reputation can unfortunately come at the expense of organizational learning. In this case, it was, to use the proverb, swept under the carpet and hidden. Anyway, I alluded to this elder male essentially being able to hone his skills to cumulative risk stack and assess the vulnerability of this young junior colleague. And so I wish to explain that vulnerability is often misunderstood because people tend to judge confidence by appearance. For example, this young female projected a distinctive identity: dyed pink hair, oversized graphic t-shirts, heavy boots, a grunge aesthetic. To some of her male peers, boys her own age, her contemporaries, that presentation may have suggested confidence, independence, or somebody who is difficult to approach. Young men her own age may find this female difficult to approach, which may explain the absence of male attention that ultimately leaves her potentially susceptible to exploitability through her want and need to be validated. However, appearance and internal confidence are not the same thing. And so, for example, I am positing that perhaps her external presentation is to compensate for her inner insecurities. And so her distinctive external appearance could actually be to compensate for her internal insecurities. And so while boys her own age may be apprehensive about approaching this young female, someone with decades of life experience, for example, the elder male in this situation, may interpret the same presentation very differently. Rather than seeing certainty, they may perceive uncertainty, a desire to be noticed, or a young female who responds strongly to validation and attention. What matters is whether an individual believes another person may be emotionally vulnerable and then chooses to exploit that perceived vulnerability. In cases of grooming, the critical question is not whether someone was vulnerable in an objective sense. It's whether an exploiter perceived them as vulnerable and then progressively adjusted their behavior to take advantage of that perception. And lastly, something else that I want to discuss is how outside of this work environment, most of us exist within relatively homogenous social circles. University students will spend time with other university students. People in their early 20s generally socialize with people of a similar age. if you walk into, for example, a cafe and saw a group of 19 or 20-year-old females regularly socializing with a 63-year-old man, most people would immediately ask questions. The age disparity alone would appear unusual. The workplace changes that entirely. It institutionalizes proximity. People who would never ordinarily occupy the same social space are suddenly working side by side 8 to 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. The relationships are framed as entirely professional, and because it exists within an organizational hierarchy, nobody questions that proximity. So, not all workplaces are inherently unsafe. However, it does mean they create opportunities for relationships to develop between people who, outside of that environment, would probably never have met or formed any meaningful social connection. So, for example, in this young female's social life, her social circle, her social sphere, the presence of this elder male would not be justified. It would be perceived as abnormal. However, this elder male's presence around this female for days, weeks, months, this forced proximity within the workplace environment, it is not perceived as abnormal because he is there in a professional capacity. This elder male is hanging around with me, but in a professional capacity. But if we remove that framing, this is not a professional environment, it would be exceptionally abnormal for this male's presence to constantly be enveloping this young female. Now, we have to accept that, in most circumstances, these relationships do remain entirely appropriate. However, some do not. We have to accept that a workplace environment does force the proximity between a young female and an elder male that otherwise would not be forced in any other situations. Now, this video has been rather forensic. It is intended for educational purposes, but I'm now going to stand back and look at this objectively and just recap in order to clarify this series of events as they happened without me introducing psychological drivers and grooming mechanisms. And so we have this young female. This is her very first job, her very first role working within the Canadian film industry. She is a junior. She is the most inexperienced person on this film set. By contrast, we have an elder male employee who is the most senior and most experienced person on this film set. So the age disparity is by the most extreme, but also the environmental experience is by the most extreme. So in life experience, vocational experience, this is by far the most extreme disparity within an interpersonal dynamic within this work environment. The senior employee begins to validate this young female personally. Over time, the young female begins to accept the validation. He validates both her identity and then later her physical appearance. The female is quoted as saying, "He thinks that I'm special." He says that I remind him of his dead girlfriend who died 7 years ago. She says he hasn't had sex for 7 years, but he wants to have sex with me. I must be special. Oh, he needs to go back to hospital because he's in remission. He has leukemia, and he was asking if he can have a photograph of me. And he was asking for a photograph of her face. Now, he's only been working with her for just over a month. And this is a 63-year-old male who's going into hospital, and he's saying to this young female, "Can I have a photograph of your face to take with me to hospital because seeing your face is the only thing that's going to get me through this," even though he's got through 63 years of his life without her. It is unclear why the comparison between this young female and his deceased girlfriend, whether it's just to emphasize that this young female occupies the same unique attachment within this elder male's life, or if he's comparing her in terms of personal valuation, her core identity, which of course would be unusual. How exactly is a 20-something-year-old female being actively compared to if his deceased girlfriend was a peer? Let's say she was in her mid-50s when she passed away. It's a very odd comparison to be making. This elder male is then going around the studio saying to this young female, "I love you, I love you, I love you." The young female is reluctantly saying, "Well, okay, I don't not like you." Ultimately, the young female acquiesces and says, "Okay, I may be interested in sex." The elder employee begins to behave as if this is potentially a one-time thing, and so he tries to get as much out of the situation as possible. He admits, "That's okay, I'll take what I can get," which contradicts his earlier statements of being in love with her. He's now saying, "That's okay, I'll just take whatever I can get." And so suddenly he's saying to her, "When we have sex, can I take photographs of you? Can I take videos of you? When I'm having sex with you, am I able to document this?" and the young female obliges. So he's discernibly trying to get as much out of this situation as possible. However, it is not only a one-time thing. Of course, it escalates, and the sexual behavior begins to bleed over into the workplace environment. They're having sex regularly in the toilets, on the film set, in between takes for the Umbrella Academy. They're having inappropriate sexual relations in the car park and in other spaces in and around the studio. They're also breaking strict COVID regulations and protocol. He comments that he would like to lick her asshole, but he may need mouthwash afterwards. Classic negging. Clearly, this is an act that he wants to engage in, but he's framing it as, I'm doing you a favor, and also, you're dirty, but I'm going to do this anyway. The young female is constantly justifying his behavior by saying, he's just a nice guy. He bought another male colleague some tires for his pickup. He's just a nice old guy who likes to be generous with his money. And yet, the offer to pay for this other male colleague's tires was not made between the senior employee and this third-party male employee. It was done overtly, explicitly, in the presence of other people, including this young female. So basically, we have this senior elder employee in front of other people declares, I will buy you tires for your pickup. Now, whilst this is speculative, it is not unreasonable to suggest that this man is basically curating an image amongst colleagues that he is a nice guy, he's a generous guy, he would not harm anybody, he's altruistic, which of course diverts attention away from, hang on, why is he associating with that very young female? So all the other colleagues around have this perception of this senior employee as, well, he's a nice guy, he's generous, and thereafter they would never suspect something untoward, which is classic grooming adjacent behavior, a presentation of yourself that's curated as a self-protective mechanism. If anybody notices that this elder employee is spending an inordinate amount of time around this young female employee and they begin to question it, they of course stop to think, no wait, he's just a nice older guy, he probably sees her as a daughter, he's probably just like being mentoring her because he's such a nice guy, he's so generous. Anyway, ultimately, it is discovered that the young female and their most senior employee have been engaging in inappropriate sexual activity in and around the studio, and they've also been breaching COVID protocol. They ultimately create a subterfuge in order to dismiss the both of them at the same time, simultaneously. Nobody else is fired out of a workforce of over 100. Just these two. And the sexual misconduct is basically swept under the carpet, meaning that this predator was able to be hired immediately at another studio across town, where he can potentially engage once more in predation with another vulnerable young female employee. And it was subsequently discovered that this senior male employee actually had a history of inappropriate sexual activity in the workplace. So this is somebody known within the Canadian film industry as a workplace sexual predator, but in order to avoid institutional scrutiny, organizations are failing to disclose the actual reason as to this man's dismissal, meaning that they are facilitating his inappropriate behavior within the industry. So of course this is very serious. Thank you for listening. All quoted conversational extracts and events described can be corroborated and substantiated through empirical evidence.